As we begin here this evening, we want to begin with a question. With a question. And that question is simply this. With the law, there is what? With the law, there is what?
Sin.
Okay, there's sin.
Wrath.
There is wrath.
Responsibility.
Huh?
Responsibility.
Okay, there's responsibility.
There's a penalty for it.
Okay, there is a penalty. All right, now let's go back to verse 15. Because the answer is there in verse 15. John gives one correct answer, but there is also another answer. Verse 15. Because the law worketh wrath. Now let's just stop here for a minute. What is meant here by the law? Okay, the law of Moses. Okay, so we're continuing along this idea. In fact, if you remember, at the end of our class last week, we talked about here everything's going to come to a head now. The Old Testament law versus the law of what? Starts with an F. The law of faith. And so it's all going to come to a head now, if you will. Because the law worketh wrath. For where no law is, there is no transgression. What is meant by transgression?
Violation.
Okay, violation? Okay. Anybody else? What is meant here by transgression?
Can't be broken.
Let's go here first.
It can't be broken.
Okay, can't be broken. Okay, now over here.
If there's no law, there's no disobedience to the law.
Okay, if there's no law, there's no disobedience. The word transgression means, it is used here metaphorically, and it means a disregarding or a violating. Okay, so Paul says here, where there is no law, there is no transgression. And so there is no violating or no disregarding. Why?
You don't know about it.
Huh?
You don't know about it. There's no law.
Okay, because there's no law.
Nothing to disregard.
Okay, there's nothing to disregard. There is no transgression because there is no law. Okay, now, is Paul teaching something new here that we never realized before? No. But rather, what is he saying here? He's kind of using a little bit of opposite understanding or opposite teaching here, doesn't he?
Break the law if there's no law.
Okay, you can't break a law if there is no law. But here's the kicker. There is a law. Or there was a law. Okay, what law are we talking about?
The old law of Moses.
Okay, the old law of Moses. The law of Moses or the Old Testament law. Okay, so there was a law, and therefore, since there was a law, there has been what? Okay, there's been sin, or there has been a violating of the law. There has been a disobedience of the law because there was a law. Okay. With the Mosaic or Old Testament law, there came a violating of the law. And because man violated the law, John, what came because of that?
Wrath.
Wrath. Okay, wrath came because of that. Okay, whose wrath? God's wrath. Okay, so what do you think is meant here by wrath? Anger. Okay, why is God angry? Because the law was being disobeyed. It was being disregarded. It was being violated. And so there is a law. There was a law, the Mosaic law, the Old Testament law, and because man was violating it, God's anger was upon them. Anybody have a different translation?
Yeah. Because law can only bring God's anger on those who disobey. And if there is no law, then there is nothing to disobey.
Okay, so if there is no law, there's nothing to disobey. But there is a law. What translation is that?
That was easy, Bruce.
Okay, the easy to read translation. Easy to read translation. Here's the Bible in basic English. For the outcome of the law is wrath, but where there is no law, it will not be broken. Okay, that makes that it's easy to understand that, isn't it? If there's no law, we didn't break anything. But there was a law, and man broke it. Because man broke the law, because he broke the law, and wrath came because of it. Can one be justified by the keeping of the Old Testament law?
No, because they couldn't keep it.
Because they couldn't keep it. Okay, so the answer to that question is no. Man cannot be justified. He cannot be made righteous. He cannot be saved by the mere keeping of the Old Testament law, because man violated it. Okay, now, what was the problem with the Old Testament law? Did it have a problem?
Yes, nobody could keep it.
Okay, nobody can keep it. Nobody can keep it. And so, yes, it had a problem. What was the problem? Janet's right.
Sinfulness.
Okay, sinfulness. Janet was right in the first answer. You know, nobody could keep it. Let's take a look in the book of Hebrews. Now, here's Hebrews chapter 7, verses 18 through 19. And this particular passage, and there's another passage in Hebrews that I will ask you about here in just a minute. But Hebrews chapter 7, verses 18 and 19 tells us what was the problem with the law. All right, beginning in verse 18. For on the one hand, there is an annulling of the former commandment. Now, what is being referred to here by the former commandment? Okay, the old law. Now, to be even more correct in the answer, we're talking here in the chapter, the context is dealing with the law of the Levites. The Levites were the priests. Okay, that law, that commandment has been annulled. What's annulled mean? Done away with. But it also carries with it, in a deeper sense, the Old Testament law. For on the one hand, there is an annulling of the former commandment because of its weakness and unprofitableness. Now this, by the way, is the New King James Version of the Bible. Okay, so what does Paul here say about the Old Testament law? Just in verse 18. What's he say?
It's gone.
Okay, it's gone. Why? Because it was weak and unprofitable. It was weak and unprofitable. Weak means that it had no strength. It had no strength. It was feeble.
ESV says weak and useless.
Okay, says what?
ESV says weak and useless.
Okay, weak and useless. Okay, that kind of answers the question, what is meant by unprofitableness? Did everybody hear the second part of Dave's answer? So what is meant by unprofitableness?
Useless.
Okay, useless. It means useless. Okay, so what has no strength? The former commandment. What is useless? Well, the former commandment. The Old Testament law. Okay. So, if these things are useless, what did God do?
He did away with it.
Okay, he did away with it, and he did what?
He gave it to Christ.
Okay, he made a new law. Okay, notice what we underlined there. Janet, you're right. But let's notice what is underlined here according to this verse. It was useless and it was unprofitable, for the law made nothing perfect. Here's why it was useless and unprofitable. I got ahead of myself. Because it did not make anyone perfect. What do you think is meant by perfect?
Blameless.
Okay, blameless. It could not make anyone perfect. Could not make anyone blameless. And so it was weak. It was unprofitable because it could not make one justified. It could not make one righteous. It could not save anyone. Now, what did God do? TJ, what'd you say?
Saint Christ.
Okay, he sent Christ, but he did what? He did something else. He brought in a better hope. What is meant here by better hope?
Instead of having nothing, which is what we have with the old law,
Okay.
we now at least have the hope of salvation, the hope of justification.
Okay. And we have that hope because of what? Now, not because of Christ. Although that's a good answer. I can understand that answer. But we have a better hope because of what? The law of faith. The law of faith. And so God brought in a better hope. God brought in the law of faith. Here's another passage of Scripture. What did God bring in? Well, in Hebrews, the 8th chapter, verses 6 through 7. But now he hath obtained a more excellent ministry, by how much also he is the mediator of a better covenant. Okay, so what did God bring in? He brought in a better covenant. He brought in a better hope. He brought in a better covenant. For if the first covenant had been faultless, then no place should have been sought for the second. But the first one could not justify, could not make you righteous, could not save you. And so we needed a better covenant. All right, so what did God bring in? God brought in the law of faith, which is what is meant here in verse 16. Therefore, it is of faith. What is of faith? What is of faith?
Says right there in grace.
Okay.
It's the new covenant that he gave us.
Okay, it's the new covenant. What is of faith is the promise made that it might be made sure to all of the seed. And so God brought in the law of faith. All right, why? Why did he bring in the law of faith?
So that we would,
Go ahead.
so that we wouldn't have wrath.
So that we wouldn't have wrath. He brought in the law of faith. What, Janet, what was you going to say?
Same thing.
Okay. He brought in the law of faith because it was the law of works was being violated. And it brought in God's wrath. And so he brought in the law of faith that the promise might become, that it might be made sure. That the promise might be made sure. The phrase,
I like the way the Bible begins with that. It says, for the first agreement, I like covenant bear agreement. But the first agreement had been as good as possible, there would have been no place for the second.
okay, you're back in Hebrews chapter 8.
Now,
Huh?
yeah, is that where you was at? Did we done-
Right now we're back in Romans.
Oh,
That's all right. That's all right. That's all right.
that's good, I like it.
But that's all right. That's all right. Now let's talk about the phrase "to the end." What do you think is meant here by that phrase? What do you think is meant by the phrase "to the end"?
Into the overall.
All right, for the purpose of. For the purpose of. That entire phrase comes from the Greek word eis, which here means of the place, time, or figuratively, purpose of. Okay. What is meant here? If you used to look up the idea of purpose in the dictionary would define purpose how?
The reason something is done.
Okay, the reason something is done. All right, here's the reason God brought in the law of faith. What reason is that? Very next phrase. Okay, that the promise might be sure. There is the purpose or why he brought in the law of faith. That the promise might be made sure. Okay. Now, what question does that bring up? What question does that bring up?
Well, my question is,
Okay.
and this probably is clear out from left field, but if he had this agreement with Abraham, then why was the Ten Commandments handed down after this agreement with Abraham? Now, like I said, this is out in left field, but I want to know.
Why was the Ten Commandments laid down after Abraham? First of all, Abraham lived long before Moses.
Yeah.
And you got to remember, Abraham was the father of the Israelites. And so the Israelites were not even in existence as of yet. Okay. Not in existence as of yet. Now, what promise did God make Abraham?
Through his seed, all nations are going to be blessed.
Okay, through his seed, all nations are going to be blessed. And he made that promise based upon what? Faith. Okay, Abraham believed, and so God declared him to be righteous, declared him to be innocent, and he said, I'm going to bless you because you believed and you obeyed. When circumcision came about for the Israelites, that circumcision was a sign of what? Now, we're not talking Abraham, but the circumcision of the Israelites was a sign of what? The covenant with God, which was, okay, you obey me, then you're going to be blessed. What was the problem? Verse 15, they didn't obey. They violated the Old Testament law. So I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Well, it does.
It does? Okay. All right, so what was the promise that is being spoken of here? Promise to who?
Well, is that promise to all of Abraham's descendants?
Okay, to all of Abraham's descendants. The promise, that the promise would be sure unto all the seed. Okay, now, when Paul here talks about seed, what's he talking about? Janet's right. Family. Okay. Now, I think we'll get into that a little bit deeper here, just a little bit. But it is a promise that was made that might be sure unto all of the family. Well, the promise that is being spoken of here is the promise of verse 11. Okay, so let's go back to verse 11. We have it up here on the screen. Okay, now the question is, what was the promise? Well, verse 11. And he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had yet being uncircumcised, that he might be the father of them all that believe, though they be not circumcised, that righteousness might be imputed unto them also. Okay, so what was the promise? Righteousness. That they would be, and what is meant by righteousness, you remember? What is meant by righteousness? Okay, acceptable unto God. And so the promise was they would be acceptable unto God. That's the promise. And it was a promise that was made unto all his seed, or to all his family, that they would be declared righteous, or they would be declared acceptable unto God. That was the promise. Now, Paul also speaks of the promise in Acts the 13th chapter. He was speaking to the people in the city of Antioch of Pisidia, and he spoke of the promise of God. In Acts the 13th chapter, verse 38 and 39, this is, I'm not sure what translation this is. I really couldn't find it. But I liked how it translated this verse. Therefore, my brothers, I want you to know that through Jesus the forgiveness of sins is proclaimed unto you. Through him everyone who what? believes is what? Justified. Okay, there's the promise. Now, what does justify mean? Close? Oh, to be declared innocent. Okay, now wait a minute, Tom. Wait a minute. We're talking about two different words here. Now let's just stop and let's just think. If you are declared innocent, then are you righteous or acceptable unto God? Without a doubt. Are you not saved? Without a doubt. And so we're talking here about the same thing. And so to be declared innocent, who was going to be declared innocent? All who believe. Now in the New Testament, belief is connected to what? Belief is connected to what? Believe and obey. Okay, believe and obey. Now, whose example is that? Abraham's. That's Abraham's example. So, if you follow the example of Abraham, therefore it is of faith, that it might be by grace to the end the promise be sure to all the seed. All right. If you follow the example of Abraham. Now look at this verse. Who is included here? Everybody's included. Whether they be of the law or whether they be of faith. So who's included here? The Jews and the Gentiles. No matter who you are, if you follow the example of Abraham, which is believe and obey, the promise is going to be yours. The promise is going to be yours. Everybody understand? Yes, sir.
Here it says, it is for all who live with faith as Abraham did.
Exactly right. Who follow the example of Abraham.
And you see through Abraham what faith did. It
Exactly right.
made him leave the country, it made him go and sacrifice his kid.
In fact, that's Hebrews
11,
8.
8 and 17.
Okay, 8. And we are told, and he was commanded to leave his own house, not knowing where he was going. And we're told that Abraham did what? He believed and obeyed.
Same way verse 17 or 18 where he took Isaac up on the hill.
Okay. So he believed and he obeyed. And so whether you are Jew or Gentile, if you follow the example of Abraham, you will be acceptable unto God.
Yeah, but this is aimed at the Jews. This is really aimed at the Jews, because in chapter 5, the Gentiles, this is not, it's not binding, it's not, it's not holding to them. He's taking the Jews and trying to get them a different mindset,
Exactly right.
and it's,
Exactly right. Trying to get them to accept something that is opposite of what they have lived and believed for so long.
And that's a continuous problem today.
Continuous problem today. Exactly right. Okay. And so, no matter who you are, Jew or Gentile, if you follow Abraham's example, then you will be accepted. Now, look at the last part of the verse. And then we'll bring in verse 17. The last part of verse 16. Therefore it is of faith, that it might be by grace to end the promise, to the end the promise might be sure to all the seed, not only which is of the law, but to that also which is of faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all, as it is written, I have made thee a father of many nations. How well is this setting with the Jews? We've asked that question several times.
They don't like it.
Okay. This is something new for them, isn't it? But Paul is really hammering home a point here. as it is written, I have made thee a father of how many? Many nations. Okay, now, where is that found? In your study, did you happen to find or come across where it was found?
Well, it talks about it in Genesis, doesn't it?
Talks about it in Genesis. Yeah?
Wait a minute.
Huh? Okay, exactly right. Genesis chapter 17 and verse 5. Okay, here it is. 17:5. And this is, I believe, the King James Version. Neither shall your name be any more called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for a father of many nations have I made you. A father of many nations. Okay? When we're talking here about nations, the question we ask here on the screen is, he's the father of what type of nations?
Jew and Gentile.
Okay, Jew and Gentile. Okay, so we're talking here nations in the physical sense. So was he the father of many nations in the physical sense?
No.
Yes.
Why?
Why?
He only had one son.
Oh, no. No. He had a son called Ishmael
Yeah.
that was from Sarah's handmaiden.
And when they went into the land of Canaan, he was very particular to tell them, leave this little family
Yeah.
alone.
And so he is the father of several physical nations. The Israelites, the Edomites, the Ishmaelites, and the Mennonites. So these father of many nations.
I
Is,
would take it to mean that.
okay, what do you take it to mean?
You know, when God's running, your descendants will be as many as the stars in the sky.
Mhm.
So I'm thinking that that just means everybody ever created.
Okay,
That Abraham will be the father of all
okay.
who believe and obey and have faith.
Okay, who believe and obey. Key words. I was just waiting on you, Janet, to get to those key words. See, we're not only talking about physical kingdoms, but we're talking about what type of kingdom? Spiritual kingdom. That is what is being taught here in Romans chapter 4. That he is not only the father of Israel and all of these other nations, he is now the father of a spiritual nation that is made up, Janet, of who? Everybody who,
Jews, Gentiles, everybody.
as long as they Believe.
Obey.
and obey. Exactly right. All those who believe and obey are now a part of Abraham's spiritual family. Wow. Okay. All a part of Abraham's spiritual family. And so God was going to make him the father of many nations. Once again, how was this possible? That he was going to make him the father of many nations? Because he did what?
Through Jesus. Through Jesus.
Okay, he had faith and he obeyed. He believed and he obeyed. Now, let's talk about the next phrase in verse 17. What we just said is vital to understanding this phrase. As it is written, I have made thee a father of many nations before him whom he believed, even God. Now, the King James, that's a little bit difficult to understand, isn't it?
Yes.
What is meant here, do you think, by the word before? By the word before. I'm trying to think of an illustration without me leaving this camera. TJ, stand up. Now, John, you stand up. Okay, okay, now, TJ, turn around. All right, TJ is standing before his father. Okay, standing before his father means what? He's standing in front of him. Okay, thanks a lot. Okay, he's standing in front of him. In fact, he is standing opposite of him. Not in a bad way, but they're standing looking face to each other. That's the meaning of this phrase before in the Greek. It means before one or directly opposite. And so Abraham is standing before who? God. He's standing before God, and what is he showing God? His belief. He's standing before God, and he's showing God his belief. Okay.
The English Standard uses in the presence of God.
Okay, in the presence of God. Here is the International Standard. As it is written, I have made you the father of many nations. Abraham acted in faith when he stood in the presence of God. And would you say that translation said? Same thing? Okay. When he stood in the presence of God, he showed his belief. He showed his belief. Okay. Now, who quickeneth the dead. Now, quicken, and I pushed the button too soon, but quicken means to make alive or to make, to vitalize. Okay? Now, I know I don't have this definition on the slide, but what does vitalize mean? What does vitalize mean? Okay, to renew, to restore. Okay, I can that's good. You look it up in the dictionary, it means to give strength or to give energy, which would be the same thing. And so to vitalize, you give someone strength, you give someone energy. And so Abraham believed that God made alive the dead and calleth those things which be not as though they were. Okay. Now, let's continue on with the International Standard. Abraham acted in faith when he stood in the presence of God, who gives life to the dead and calls into existence things that don't yet exist. Okay. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean?
Well, according to Johnson, what that means is Abraham was old, Sarah was old. So he is going to revitalize their reproductive systems so that they can bear a child.
Okay. Okay. Two questions. Number one, who was dead? I'm not going to tell you whether Janet's right or wrong. There is a right or wrong to that. Who was dead? Now just think about it. Who was dead?
Right there.
Hmm? Okay. Well, hang on to that. And what didn't exist yet? Okay. Well, the answer is actually given in the next several verses. Janet, is that where you got your answer? Amen. That is, she is right in what she said. Look at the next several verses, 18, 19, 20, and 21. 18, 19, 20, and 21. Here is what Abraham believed. Hope in spite of hopeless circumstances. Okay, what was the hopeless circumstance?
He was old.
He was old.
So was Sarah.
Okay, he was old. He was old, and he thought that his body was dead, and because he was 100 years old, and Sarah was also unable to have children. In other words, here it is. What are we told about Sarah in the book of Genesis?
She was young and way beyond childbearing years.
Okay, she was barren. She was barren, and Janet, what'd you say?
And way beyond.
And way beyond childbearing years. Okay, turn to Hebrews, the 11th chapter, and verse 30. Hebrews 11th chapter. I don't have it on slide. I'm sorry. Hebrews 11th chapter and verse 30. Okay, someone, when you get there, read that from the King James Version of the Bible. Genesis 11 and 30.
Genesis
Yes. Did I say Hebrews? Okay, now remember, we got a tape that we can go back and check. Did I say Hebrews? All right, Genesis.
Yeah, Hebrews 11.
Sarah was
Okay.
barren.
Okay, Sarah was barren.
No children.
Okay, what does barren mean? Okay, unable to have children. She was sterile, right? Now turn to Genesis, the 18th chapter, verse 11. Okay. So, somebody gave the answer she was barren. Somebody gave the answer that she was beyond childbearing years. Guess what what Genesis 18:11 says? We'll go back and check the tape. I didn't say Hebrews.
Yeah, but Hebrews 11:11 is a good statement.
It's a good statement, yeah. Okay, so Genesis, the 18th chapter. Somebody read that. Verse 11.
Now Abraham and Sarah were old and well stricken in age, and it ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of them.
Okay. Okay, it ceased to be with Sarah as the manner of women. Is that what the King James says? What does that mean?
Past childbearing.
She was past childbearing age. Here's the Bible in basic English. Abraham and Sarah were very old, and Sarah was past the time for giving birth. And so we're told those two things about Sarah in the book of Genesis. And so he was hoping in spite of hopeless circumstance. In other words, he had faith. He had faith. All right. He also had faith that he would become the father of many nations. He believed that. All right, let's go on and read. Verse 18. We're back in Romans 4. Hoping in spite of hopeless circumstances, he believed that he would become the father of many nations, just as he had been told, this is how many descendants you will have. His faith, and this, by the way, is the international standard, in case you're wondering. His faith did not weaken when he thought about his own body, which was already as good as dead now that he was about 100 years old, or about Sarah's inability to have children. Nor did he doubt God's promise out of a lack of faith. Instead, his faith became stronger, and he gave God the glory. He gave glory to God. Verse 21. Being absolutely convinced. He was convinced of what?
That God would do what he said.
That God would do what he promised. If somebody is absolutely convinced or fully persuaded, as we read in the King James Version, is there any doubt in his mind? No. There is no doubt. He fully believed, he fully had faith in God that God would do as he had promised. Wow. He was fully convinced. And what happened because he was fully convinced?
Sarah conceived a child.
Okay, Sarah conceived a child. What happened because he was fully convinced? Verse 22.
It was counted to him as righteous.
It was accounted to him for righteousness. In other words, he was what? What does righteous mean? Acceptable unto God. Because he was fully convinced that God would keep his promise, he had that much faith and he obeyed. God declared him to be acceptable. God declared him to be acceptable. Here's Romans chapter 4, 21 and 22, and this is the contemporary English version. Abraham was certain that God can do what he had promised, so God accepted him. All because of his faith and his obedience. Now, 23, 24, and 25. Bear in mind what we just read in verse 22. Therefore it was imputed to him for righteousness. Okay? Now, beginning in verse 23. Now it was not written for his sake alone, that it was imputed to him. What was imputed to him? Huh? Righteousness. Righteousness. Okay, he was acceptable unto God. Okay, so it's not written for his sake, for Abraham's sake alone, but for us also, to whom it shall be imputed. What shall be imputed? Righteousness. We shall be declared acceptable unto God if. What's the importance of if here?
There's a condition.
There's a condition. Okay, and what is that condition? Okay, that we believe on him that raised up Christ our Lord from the dead, who was delivered for our offenses and was raised again for our justification. Okay, so we shall be declared righteous unto God if we believe on him who raised him from the dead. What was Abraham's example? Believe and obey. So, in order for you and I to be declared righteous, we've got to believe and obey. If we do that, then we'll be delivered from our offenses and we'll be justified. Okay. There we have the faith of Abraham. The faith of Abraham. Any questions, any comments over the 4th chapter? Anything?
You were here in Hebrews 11.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't realize that Sarah, through faith, also Sarah herself received strength to conceive seed and was delivered of a child when she was past age, because she judged him faithful. She judged him faithful who had promised. I was always under the idea that Sarah didn't think didn't have that faith.
Well, because she laughed when she first heard it.
She laughed at first. And then she came to believe just as Abraham did. Now, just use a little bit of necessary inference, just a little bit of thinking. What if Abraham believed, but Sarah did not?
I don't think it would have worked.
So it had to have been both had to believe, didn't they? In order for that promise to come about. All right, so next time we will begin in Genesis, the 5th chapter. That'll be 2 weeks from tonight.
And that's on tape. You said Genesis 5.
Okay, we'll be in Romans, the 5th chapter. Okay? Romans, the 5th chapter. The next time. And so that'll be 2 weeks from tonight. Next week is praise and prayer, right? Yeah, next week is praise and prayer. So it'll be 2 weeks from tonight that we'll get into the next topic.